Yeah, Jordan is up at 9,000 feet in the Rockies over Taos, New Mexico. And so sometimes he doesn't have good internet. Sometimes he has terrific, better than mine. But we are online on YouTube. And good evening, everyone. This evening, Nick Lawrence is going to chair our program, and we're going to talk about the will to power. I've just had hip surgery, as many of you know, 4 days ago. And so I'm going to take the prerogative of boogieing out for this session. But I have great confidence that Nick will be able to see you through, and I will come back at 9:45. In the meantime, in that time, I'm also going to read this chapter so that I can ask any questions at the end that I might have. So anyway, Nick, you're in charge, and I'm out of here.
All right. See you shortly. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about the third chapter in Jung's collected works, volume. This is volume 7. Yeah, volume 7. 2 essays on analytical psychology. We've read the previous chapters up to this point into the YouTube channel. So if you want some context, you can go back and refer to those videos. But in past weeks, we've just read the paragraphs, which are pretty lengthy, and then had some discussion. So if you guys don't mind, I'll just go ahead and start us off. So we are on page 30, paragraph 35, and the title of the chapter is The Other Point of View, The Will to Power. All right. So far, we've considered the problem of this new psychology essentially from the Freudian point of view. Undoubtedly, it has shown us a very real truth to which our pride, our civilized consciousness, may say no, though something else in us says yes. Many find this fact extremely irritating. It arouses their hostility or even their fear, and consequently, they are unwilling to recognize the conflict. And indeed, it is a frightening thought that man has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but a positively demonic dynamism. 1 second here. All right, noted skip. I will check the attendees. Okay, continuing. The individual seldom knows anything of this. To him, as an individual, it is incredible that he should ever, in any circumstances, go beyond himself. But let these harmless creatures form a mass, and there emerges a raging monster. And each individual is only one tiny cell in the monster's body, so that for better or worse, he must accompany it on its bloody rampages and even assist it to the utmost. Having a dark suspicion of these grim possibilities, man turns a blind eye to the shadow side of human nature. Blindly, he strives against the salutary dogma of original sin, which is yet so prodigiously true. Yes, he even hesitates to admit the conflict of which he is so painfully aware. It can readily be understood that a school of psychology, even if it be biased and exaggerated in this or that respect, which insists on the seamy side, is unwelcome, not to say frightening, because it forces us to gaze into the bottomless abyss of this problem. A dim premonition tells us that we cannot be whole without this negative side, that we have a body which, like all bodies, casts a shadow, and that if we deny this body, we cease to be three-dimensional and become flat and without substance. Yet this body is a beast with a beast soul, an organism that gives unquestioning obedience to instinct. To unite oneself with this shadow is to say yes to instinct, so that formidable dynamism lurking in the background. From this, the ascetic morality of Christianity wishes to free us, but at the risk of disorganizing man's animal nature at the deepest level. So that is the end of the first paragraph, which is clearly quite a long one. So any thoughts?
Well, the first thing that struck me is the way he talks about only one tiny cell in the monster's body. And it made me think about the time frame when this was written and what the conception was of cells in a body and cells that would be part of a monster. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Nick, about sort of perspective, because he's talking about science and he's also talking about.
I think in this case, he's just speaking figuratively.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly several things that, don't stand up in the light of today's scientific understanding of the world in Jung's writing, but I don't think this is to be taken as a literal thought about a cell in a body.
Okay. But he is talking about something really tiny, right? Minute.
Yeah, I think he's just saying that, this is kind of this thread that's echoed in several different points of Jung's work, where he's just talking about the individual versus the collective, or not so much versus the collective, but in contrast to the collective. And kind of, there's this idea, he uses a term called participation mystique. And it's just this idea of like identification with mass morality or whatever spirit has come over a mass of people. You can think of the example of like political rallies or any kind of thing like that, where an individual, when enmeshed in a group, does something that as an individual they would probably never do. But within that group context, they kind of lose hold of themselves. So I think that's probably what he's referring to right there.
Okay. So the beast soul, at the bottom of page 30, a beast soul, an organism that gives unquestioning obedience to instinct. That's not only within the individual, that's also the individual within the collective, right? Is that what you're saying? A sort of mirroring between the part of the individual that is the shadow part and the part of the society that is responding to instinct or responding to maybe the worst instincts of a mass of people.
Well, it seems like throughout this entire paragraph, I mean, he's already laid out so much, but it seems like in the beginning, what he's saying is that even whether we want to believe this or not, we have to reckon with the fact that we're half some being with an intellect and with a sense of morality, and half this kind of animal. And we have to reconcile both of those. I know in a previous chapter, we spent a lot of time talking about some of the comments that Jung made about harmonizing culture and nature within oneself. And I still think that he's driving at that same point right here.
Okay.
Especially in the last couple of sentences of the paragraph. Yeah. Who wants to take up the next paragraph?
I could do that.
Okay, great.
Paragraph 36. Has anyone made clear to himself what that means? A yes saying to instinct. That was what Nietzsche desired and taught, and he was in deadly earnest. With a rare passion, he sacrificed himself, his whole life, to the idea of the Superman, to the idea of the man who, through obedience to instinct, transcends himself. And what was that, the course of that life? It was, as Nietzsche himself prophesied in Zarathustra, in that foreboding vision of the fatal fall of the rope dancer, the man who would not be, quote, surpassed. To the dying rope dancer, Zarathustra says, quote, thy soul will sooner be dead than thy body, close quote. And later the dwarf says to Zarathustra, quote, O Zarathustra, stone of wisdom, high thou flingest thyself, but every stone that is flung must fall. Condemned to thyself and to thine own stoning, O Zarathustra, far indeed thou flingest the stone, but upon thyself will it fall. Close quote. And when he cried his ecce homo over himself, again it was too late. As once before, when this saying was uttered and the crucifixion of the soul began, before the body was dead.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty powerful stuff. I don't know how many of us are familiar with this section in Thus Spake Zarathustra, but pretty early on in the book, he's got this section. I mean, I think every chapter in the book is only 2 or 3 pages long. He has a very short section about this kind of tightrope dancer, and this is the situation that he's outlining here. But I really don't have much to add apart from I'm really thankful to hear somebody just kind of drive at the fact that while Nietzsche was a brilliant man and is probably rightly understood as being amongst the greatest philosophers of his era, his life ended in ruin and madness. And
Right.
you know, I've tried to vocalize this, particularly in philosophy classes that I've had, where I'm not exactly interested in taking on the ideas of a person whose life was in such disarray and ended in such a horrible way.
Mhm. The rope dancer brought to mind for me the painting by Man Ray. It's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, so I've seen it many, many, many times. I remember buying the postcard of it many times, partly because it reminded me also of Duchamp's Large Glass, where there are the costumes of the groom. So in the rope dancer, there are these figures, and they are joined by what you might call a thread. In the Duchamp, these costumes, so to speak, are part of a mechanism, almost like a merry-go-round going around. So there are these choices. And in the Man Ray, the idea is that the rope dancer is accompanied by her shadow or her shadows. And so I never thought of that as having any relation to Jung, Nietzsche, or anything else. I just thought it was surrealism and the relationship between these artists who were using a shared vocabulary of imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Now I think maybe they were. I mean, that was, the rope dancer was 1916. Maybe.
Yeah, it definitely could have been a reference to Nietzsche. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think that this first book was written, or the first edition of this book was written in 1916 and published in 1917. So I don't know if it would have been a direct.
Well, I wonder.
Certainly to Nietzsche. I mean, he was quite popular at that point.
Right. I wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also just interesting too. You know, Nietzsche, and he talks about this later. He was a philologist and is known almost above and beyond his philosophy. Is known for his brilliant use of language, and already Jung is using some of his language, and you can see how he's kind of laying the groundwork for what he later does with this notion of the tightrope dancer, which I quite enjoy.
Right. Cool.
All right, Beth, you want to take on paragraph 37?
Paragraph 37. We must look very critically at the life of one who taught such a yes-saying in order to examine the effects of this teaching on the teacher's own life. When we scrutinize his life with this aim in view, we are bound to admit that Nietzsche lived beyond instinct in the lofty heights of heroic sublimity, heights that he could maintain only with the help of the most meticulous diet, a carefully selected climate, and many aids to sleep, until the tension shattered his brain. He talked of yes saying and lived the nay. His loathing for man, for the human animal that lived by instinct, was too great. Despite everything, he could not swallow the toad, so often dreamed of, and which he feared had to be swallowed. The roaring of the Zarathustrian lion drove back into the cavern of the unconscious all the, quote, higher, end quote, men who were clamoring to live. Hence his life does not convince us of his teaching, for the, quote, higher, end quote, man wants to be able to sleep without chloral. Help me with
Laurel, yeah, I had to look that up myself, but apparently it's a sedative.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And if I do say anything wrong, please correct me, because to live in Naumburg and Basel despite fogs, quote, fogs and shadows, end of quote. He desires wife and offspring, standing and esteem among the herd, innumerable commonplace realities, and not least of the Philistine. Nietzsche failed to live this instinct, the animal urge to life. For all his greatness and importance, Nietzsche's was a pathological personality.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that he's starting to kind of say that there was clearly more going on with Nietzsche than what he was saying in his philosophy. It wasn't all about living out the life of pure and raw instinct, but there was clearly something else afoot with what Nietzsche was putting forth. Yeah, and like I said, the chloral thing completely missed me. I had no clue what that was, but yeah, apparently it was a sedative. And yeah, I mean, Nietzsche, even before he lost his mind, lived a pretty miserable life. Apparently had all kinds of medical issues and insomnia, and I want to say maybe even gout or something like that. But yeah, tough go at it. All right. I will go ahead with 38.
I just have one question. Are you able
Okay.
to, or do you have time to explain that Naumburg?
Yeah, I think those are both towns in Switzerland. And
Okay.
Basel is where I think that's actually where Jung grew up, or maybe right outside of Basel, but also that's where Nietzsche was a professor for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to read all of this too, because if you read something like Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which is Jung's autobiography,
Starting to read that.
he talks about how he always felt this closeness to Nietzsche because he was a professor in the same town that Jung grew up in and around the same time that Jung was kind of coming of age, and was really, Nietzsche was super popular at around the time that Jung was kind of getting out and forming his own thought. He also writes at some point in his autobiography that he was afraid that he was like Nietzsche, and he had a secret that was too large to tell anybody. And I think that he was referring to the period in which he wrote his Red Book. But it's so fascinating to note how Nietzsche kind of had his own Red Book experience with Thus Spake Zarathustra, and that eventually kind of led to his downfall, whereas Jung had the wherewithal to make some work out of that and make some meaning of that experience.
I just looked up Naumburg quickly because I thought it was in Germany, and it is, and it's not very close to Basel.
Gotcha.
And there is this is just Google, a Nietzsche house that they say is a building dedicated to the life and work of the German philosopher. That seems to imply to me that maybe he was born there. But yeah, he taught in Basel, and of course Jung was Swiss, so I don't know more.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for that. Okay, so paragraph 38.
Right.
But what was it that he lived, if not the life of instinct? Can Nietzsche really be accused of having denied his instincts in practice? He would scarcely have agreed to that. He could even show without much difficulty that he lived his instinctual life in the highest sense. But how is it possible, we may ask in astonishment, for man's instinctual nature to drive him into separation from his kind, into absolute isolation from humanity, into an aloofness from the herd upheld by loathing? We think of instinct as uniting man, causing him to mate, to beget, to seek pleasure and good living, the satisfaction of all sensuous desires. We forget that this is only one of the possible directions of instinct. There exists not only the instinct for the preservation of the species, but also the instinct of self-preservation, which is what he's going to call the will to power. And yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the key question for the chapter with regards to Nietzsche, because the second half of the chapter doesn't really deal with Nietzsche at all, but the question of how can living into kind of the animal within oneself truly separate one from all other people. That doesn't make great sense.
So Nick, are you saying that Jung was a student of Nietzsche?
No, I mean,
Oh.
he certainly read him a lot when he was young, but I think that when he was young, right?
Okay.
But, yeah, I just say it's funny every time I have to refer to a young Jung, I feel the need to go back and say Jung very clearly. But anyways, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that he read Nietzsche and a lot of philosophers. He in fact studied philosophy for a long time, but at some point kind of felt like he touched the bottom and it wasn't quite deep down enough for him, so he moved away from philosophy. But yeah.
I guess it was when you mentioned Nietzsche teaching in Basel. I was wondering whether that meant Jung had studied, but I guess it just means he was.
No, I don't think that he ever knew him.
Nearby.
I don't think they ever met or that he studied under him or anything like that.
Okay. Shall I continue? 39.
Yeah.
It is of this last instinct, the will to power, that Nietzsche obviously speaks. Whatever else is instinctual only follows for him in the train of the will to power. From the standpoint of Freud's sexual psychology, this is an error of the most glaring kind, a misconception of biology, the bungling of a decadent neurotic. For it is a very simple matter for any adherent of sexual psychology to prove that everything lofty and heroic in Nietzsche's view of life and the world is nothing but a consequence of the repression and misunderstanding of that other instinct which this psychology regards as fundamental. So this psychology would be Jung's psychology, yes?
No, I think that's kind of a critique of Freud's sexual psychology, because he's saying, in previous chapters, he talked about psychoanalysis and the Eros theory as being more or less Freud's approach to psychology in a nutshell. But he's saying clearly that doesn't account for what's going on with Nietzsche. There's obviously something else going on, which Freudians would probably try to reduce back to the sexual psychology, but really that would be him living out his instincts, I suppose, and
I see what you
not
mean.
have put him at variance with everybody else.
Right.
Which, I think Nietzsche also was remembered as being a chronically lonely person as well. There are apparently a lot of letters that he wrote saying, like, God, I just, wish I had some friends and stuff like that, which, is really sad. But at the same time, somebody who's such a scathing critic of humanity should probably expect as much. Okay. All right,
I guess I was understanding that sentence in the opposite way, that it was the will to power and Nietzsche's view of life in the world, which this psychology regarded as fundamental, rather than the sexual Freudian side. But either way, we're understanding the same thing. Yeah. It's kind of about sentence construction. And actually, it's probably about translation.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I mean, the translation is quite strange. I mean, I've been a part of groups where people will read different translations of the same word. And oftentimes, they don't even sound like they're from the same book, depending on who's translated what. Which I have zero sense for, apart from hearing that. I mean, I don't read German, or I don't know how it translates, but all the same. Okay, Beth, you want to go with 40?
Yes. 40. The case of Nietzsche shows, on the one hand, the consequences of neurotic one-sidedness, and, on the other hand, the dangers that lurk in this leap beyond Christianity. Nietzsche undoubtedly felt the Christian denial of animal nature very deeply indeed, and therefore he sought a higher human wholeness beyond good and evil. But he who seriously criticizes the basic attitudes of Christianity also forfeits the protection which these bestow upon him. He delivers himself up unresistingly to the animal psyche. This is the moment of Dionysian frenzy, the overwhelming manifestation of the, quote, blonde beast, end of quote, which seizes the unsuspecting soul with nameless shudderings. This seizure transfers him into a hero or into a godlike being, a superhuman entity. He rightly feels himself, quote, 6,000 feet beyond good and evil, end of quote.
And Beyond Good and Evil is the title of a book by Nietzsche.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, this is also picking up on one of Nietzsche's key ideas, which is the transvaluation of all values, which I think is kind of the basis of his work, The Will to Power. I haven't read it, but as I understand it, I think that's kind of the what he's driving at, which is really just I can think of one thing that I've had to read by Nietzsche, which is Truth and Lies in the Extramoral Sense. And in that, he's talking about the way in which, I think this is how I understand it, the way in which our understanding of the world, the language that we use to describe the world, or I use to describe any object, might actually hide the essence of that thing from us, because it's really only the language that we've more or less agreed upon. Like if you and I agree that, the sky is blue, then that's really just what you and I have, the nomenclature that we've agreed upon to call the sky by, or to describe the sky by. It may or may not have anything to do with whatever it is that we're really attempting to describe.
Right.
So in that sense, he's almost trying to point one's attention towards that phenomenon, and then also say that there is an experience of something that's so raw and so real that all of these different beliefs about the world, in essence, prevent us from having. And I think that he felt that to be the case, particularly with something like Christianity. And with Nietzsche, it's almost like he wants to do away with all these value systems that kind of keep us away from a very raw experience of life and all of its beauty and tragedy as well. So where Jung says, but he who seriously criticizes the basic attitudes of Christianity also forfeits the protection which those bestow upon him.
Yeah.
He delivers himself up unresistingly to the animal psyche, which is, more or less, it seems to me, what Nietzsche kind of wanted. He was like, I can handle this extremely raw experience. And he was clearly broken by it. So that is what I would say about this paragraph. I'm sorry if you guys can hear my dog snoring in the background over here.
Okay, I have another question.
It's quite all right.
So when he's saying criticizes the basic attitudes of Christianity, also forfeits the protection which these bestow upon him, what would he have been referring to, like the protections?
Well, I think,
because that's something to do with like a peace with death, or that would be nothing at all?
no, I think that, Nietzsche was the person who also kind of, in some sense, announced the death of God,
Okay,
as it were,
okay.
right? So I think up to that point, when Jung looks back and talks about religion, or the religion in which he was born into, what he was saying is that while this whole phenomenon of the collective unconscious or the unconscious may exist and the archetypes may exist, religion has served as a means to mitigate those, to kind of to act as almost like a transformer for the raw electricity of whatever lay beyond that, and for a human to step into that and have an experience which is more or less safe. And without that kind of scaffolding to keep the individual safe from that overwhelming experience, then you kind of deliver yourself over to a power that's greater than you.
Thank you.
Does that make any sense?
It does, yeah.
Cool.
I think it's also like that term we use now of the moral compass. And when we say that someone has no moral compass, the moral compass would be, we know where we stand between good and evil, or
Right. Yeah.
truth, veracity and falsehoods, real news, made up fantasy. So somewhere when we lose our moral compass, yeah,
Yeah.
it could be Nietzsche's neurotic, or whatever Jung would call it, collapse, but it also could be just taking too much acid, or whatever, just losing a framework.
Yeah, I mean, the psychedelic thing is interesting too, because I think that we certainly see that a lot in our time, where it's like, say you take some kind of plant medicine that's traditionally used within a tradition.
Exactly.
You have somebody take it in a secular setting where there isn't that scaffolding, there isn't that in-between person to mitigate the raw experience, or to, more or less hold your hand through it. I think it's very much what Jung was also saying about the religions of the world, where they provided some kind of comfort and some kind of protection against this really raw power that otherwise would just be too much for the ego, too much for the individual.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to get into 41 here, but it's pretty freaking long.
Yeah, if you want to give up in the middle, Nick, and tell me when you want to pass it along.
Yeah, I think I will do that. Okay, 41 here. The psychological observer knows this state as, quote, identification with the shadow, unquote, phenomenon which occurs with great regularity at such moments of collision with the unconscious. The only thing that helps here is cautious self-criticism. Firstly, and before all else, it is exceedingly unlikely that one has just discovered a world-shattering truth, for such things happen extremely seldom in the world's history. Secondly, one must carefully inquire whether something similar might not have happened elsewhere. For instance, Nietzsche, as a philologist, could have adduced a few classical parallels, which would certainly have calmed his mind. Thirdly, one must reflect that a Dionysian experience may well be nothing more than a relapse into a pagan form of religion, so that in reality, nothing new is discovered and the same story only repeats itself from the beginning. Fourthly, one cannot avoid foreseeing that this joyful intensification of mood to heroic and godlike heights is certain to be followed by an equally deep plunge into the abyss. These considerations would put one in a position of advantage. The whole extravaganza could then be reduced to the proportions of a somewhat exhausting mountaineering expedition, to which succeed the eternal commonplaces of day. So yeah, I mean, there's clearly a lot there too, but he's talking about how Nietzsche just felt himself to be identified with the experience that he was having, and how, Nietzsche was a philologist, but he also studied all of the great Greek thinkers and playwrights, and wrote extensively on that topic himself. So it's quite fitting that he kind of saw himself as a devotee of Dionysus, but at the same time, through reading all of those tragedies, it seems like he would have had some reference as to what happens when you take on that identification. I mean, in countless of the Greek stories, there are instances in which someone becomes too close to a god, sees a god, identifies with a god, and they're annihilated. It also seems like this is somewhat of an early formulation of kind of Jung's idea of compensation, where he's saying, any kind of soaring height is surely to be followed by just as deep of a plunge into the depths, and that we'll find that the balance will be found between the two, more or less.
Yeah, that's the clearest image to me in this section of that paragraph, was that heroism and the height of that and the joy of that, and then the plunge. Yeah.
All right, shall I continue?
Sure, if you're up to it.
All right. Just as every stream seeks the valley and the broad river that hastens toward the flatlands, so life not only flows along in common places, but makes everything else commonplace. The uncommon, if it is not to end in catastrophe, may still end alongside the commonplace, but not often. If heroism becomes chronic, it ends in a cramp, and the cramp leads to catastrophe or to neurosis or both. Nietzsche got stuck in a state of high tension. It's again this really clever wordplay with this tightrope walker. But with this ecstasy, he could just as well have borne up under Christianity. Not that this answers the question of the animal psyche in the least, but for an ecstatic animal is a monstrosity. And the animal fulfills the law of its own life, neither more nor less. We call it obedient and quote good, but the ecstatic bypasses the law of his own life and behaves from the point of view of nature improperly. This impropriety is the exclusive prerogative of man, whose consciousness and free will can occasionally loose themselves contra naturam, which just means in opposition to nature, from their roots in animal nature. It is the indispensable of all culture, but also of spiritual sickness if exaggerated. Man can suffer only a certain amount of culture without injury. The endless dilemma of culture and nature is always a question of too much or too little, never of either or. So there's that idea again of this harmonization of culture and nature within the person. All right, this phrase contra naturam, Jung uses that at several points to say that individuation, which is his process within his psychology, is an opus contra naturam, a work opposed to nature. It could be a work opposed to nature outside of oneself, but could also be a work opposed to the nature within oneself, be it the nature that identifies with instinct and really wants to kind of eat, reproduce, and what is it, the instinct for the preservation of the species.
Yeah, I wonder how much his or the translated term culture here is related to the contrast with nature that we use as nurture and nurture being like as if you were a farmer cultivating crops instead of having wild, native plants. That sort of difference between nature and culture, because I don't think he's talking about culture as like painting in the arts and one civilization following another civilization with its, sort of accoutrements and.
Well, I don't know. He may be, because earlier he says something back in chapter 37. He says he desires wife and offspring, standing in esteem among the herd, innumerable commonplace realities, and not least those of the Philistine. So he might be contrasting, but then again, maybe not. He might be not.
Yeah, I don't know.
Be talking about culture in the sense of the arts.
Yeah, I think again we're looking at translation that we don't really know, because what we do know is that the simple language of too much or too little, never either or, that we understand.
Yeah.
But that deeper thing, because also when he says spiritual sickness, the foundation of culture, but also of spiritual sickness, culture, of course, always, I mean, I think has always had the attached what you might call stigma of, is this about holiness and beauty, or is this just about self-expression? I mean, I think that's not just a question of the modern age, right? Of pop art or, piss paintings or whatever it is, right? That it's actually something that's gone on for a very long time, probably cavemen, right? When they were depicting a hunt, I mean, I think cultural, whatever you call them, people excavating the concepts have asked those questions for time immemorial. Were they making art, quote unquote, or were they kind of chronicling their lives? Was there a higher, motive, or was it a kind of day-to-day, I'm going to teach you how I killed this bison, with this picture?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge question and conversation that would follow. But to my mind, I think they're almost inseparable.
Right. And I'm sure with Jung, it's very core to what he's talking about. I mean, I'm just thinking about his stone carving, for example. I mean, he was making, visual everything. The Red Book, it's a visual work.
Yeah. And it's really funny too. I know that we've all expressed some familiarity with the Red Book, and there's a really phenomenal interview with Peter Kingsley, who wrote a book called Catafalque, and Murray Stein.
Yes.
And I mean, it's phenomenal work, but it's somewhat contentious too. I mean, it's certainly civil, but at the same time, there's a gentle sparring going on, because he's essentially saying, like, you guys have Jung wrong.
Yeah.
Quite wrong. And it's really interesting. He notes that in some of Jung's letters to Freud, he was saying, like, this is a religion, more or less, and that we can't describe it in those terms, but we've just appropriated religion and turned it into psychology and used different terms for it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I don't think there is any separation apart from terminology.
Yeah. I think what both of us are talking about is something we'll be looking for further in this book.
Yeah.
Because obviously in the earlier chapters, when he was talking about Freud, he wasn't writing on this sort of level.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look through the table of contents too, and just even as you look through the titles of the chapters to note how much he's coming into his own. I mean, the first two chapters, it seemed like, the Jung that was pretty much Freud's son, his crown prince. But as it goes on, you can see that there's quite the development into what the Jung that everybody knows and loves. All right. Is this next one?
Shall I pick up 42?
Yeah.
The case of Nietzsche faces us with the question, what did the collision with the shadow, namely the will to power, reveal to him? Is it to be regarded as something bogus, a symptom of repression? Is the will to power genuine or merely secondary? If the conflict with the shadow had let loose a flood of sexual fantasies, the matter would be perfectly clear, but it happened otherwise. The, quote, Count des Poodles, close quote, was not eros, but the power of the ego. From this, we would have to conclude that what was repressed was not eros, but the will to power. There is, in my opinion, no ground for the assumption that eros is genuine and the will to power bogus. The will to power is surely just as mighty a daemon as eros, and just as old and original.
this Kern did poodles. I had to look that up, but it's funny. It means it's the poodle's core.
Yeah.
He's referring to a line in Faust where, you know,
Yes.
the poodle follows Faust home, and it ends up actually being the demon Mephistopheles in the form of a poodle.
Yeah.
It's quite
Count
fun.
is also seed. So it's like a seed or like close to our word kernel, right?
Yeah.
A little seed pod. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but it's funny, you know, he's saying like there's this inner nature to this problem going on where it wasn't eros, but the power of the ego and the will to power that was actually the repressed content that burst through in Nietzsche's works.
Yeah. I only recently read that Faust, and I was surprised by the poodle.
Yeah.
I wasn't anticipating it. I just wasn't familiar, you know. I mean, I thought I had this vague idea of what Faust was about, but then when I actually was reading it, and Margaret and her mother, and you know, all that, the actual details of it, there were a lot of surprises, and the poodle being such a significant aspect was quite a surprise.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Beth, do you have
maybe
anything
that's
about that?
also the beast. I mean, maybe, you know, the way he was talking, sorry to interrupt this
Oh, go ahead.
transition to the next paragraph, but an animal fulfills the law of its own life. I was thinking dogs when you were reading that phrase, although I didn't really, it wasn't right in the front of my consciousness, you know. Also, you brought up the snoring of your dog, and I was
Right.
thinking, well, I'm comforted by the snoring of a dog. I don't have a dog. I was just looking at dogs online today, you know. It's like, so yeah, it's dogs are man's best friend, but also dogs show us things about our essence.
I would agree to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. If we don't have anything else to say about this one, Beth, you want to take up 43?
Sure, and I'll just read part of that since it's long.
Okay.
43. A life like Nietzsche's lived to its fatal end with rare consistency in accordance with the underlying instinct for power cannot simply be explained away as bogus. Otherwise, one would make oneself guilty of the same unfair judgment that Nietzsche passed on his polar opposite. Do you say Wagner?
Yeah.
Everything, quote, everything about him is false. What is genuine is hidden or decorated. He is an actor in every good and bad sense of the word, end of quote. Why this prejudice? Because Wagner embodies that other elemental urge which Nietzsche overlooked and upon which Freud's psychology is built. If we inquire whether Freud knew of that other instinct, the urge to power, we find that he conceived it under the name of, quote, ego instinct, end of quote. But these, quote, ego instincts, end of quote, occupy a rather pokey little corner in his psychology compared with the broad, all too broad, development of the sexual factor. In reality, human nature bears the burden of a terrible and unending conflict between the principle of the ego and the principle of instinct. The ego, all barriers and restraint, instinct, limitless, and both principles of equal might. In a certain sense, man may count himself happy that he is, quote, conscious only of the single urge, unquote, and therefore it is only prudent to guard against ever knowing the other. But if he does learn to know the other, it is all up with him. He then enters upon the Faustian conflict. In the first part of Faust, is that Goethe?
Yeah.
Goethe. Thank you. Goethe has shown us what it means to accept instinct, and in the second part, what it means to accept the ego in its weird, unconscious world. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's really interesting how he's saying, let me see here, let me see if I can pick up on this line. The ego, all barriers and restraint, instinct limitless, and both principles of equal might. And then also before where he says, the will to power is surely just as mighty a daimon as Eros, and just as old and original. I'm thinking back to one other section here too. Let me see if I can find this. Really just the first couple of sentences of the first paragraph in this chapter where he's saying, you know, it's almost repugnant and disgusting to a man to remind man of the fact that he has a shadow and that he has all of these instincts and is not just this wholly civilized moral person. But this dichotomy between ego and instinct is really coming into the fore now.
And I think he's bringing up the question of whether that morality of the moral person is so much of a construct that it might not even apply. That it certainly didn't apply for Nietzsche because it cracked him open. And in a way, I think Jung is implying that the very nature of good and evil was cracked open by Nietzsche's not being able to, assimilate it or continue being a healthy living person by examining it.
Yeah, and it's in some sense, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't, because it's like
right.
the morality, the mass morality that you're handed with Christianity or with Christianity, as it were,
Right.
is not good enough. And
Right.
then abolishing morality is not good enough either. And to me, the middle way between each of those is what Jung is talking about with individuation, where he's not like, you need to accept the morality of your father, of the fathers or of the mass, but you need to figure out your own moral code.
Right. But we also are always adapting to the moral code that we are given, which goes back to that nature and culture. Because if we call culture the thing which has created office buildings where people walk in wearing a quote unquote uniform and have their sexuality relatively at least suppressed and are functioning in order to have an efficient society, then what's also at play is this ego and this will to power, which is not, at least in capitalism right now, is not really addressed in the same way, which is again making me think of the rope dancer and Duchamp with the uniforms of the groom, because the bride is like the rope dancer and highly sexualized, which is also highly like a natural being, you know, and then the groom, this male principle, is kind of locked in and fitting in, and then we all try to fit in.
How do you spell the last name of the painter?
Well, the rope dancer is Man Ray, so that's Man and Ray, R-A-Y.
Gotcha.
The large glass, which is the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, which has the section, which is the grooms, is Duchamp, D-U-C-H-A-M-P. So that's the piece called The Large Glass, which has that section. I mean, he also did individual. Each part of the large glass he worked on individually.
Marcel Duchamp. Okay, I got you. Right on. Okay,
right.
Cool.
So that part of it where you have the uniforms on this, you know, kind of whirligig merry-go-round kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Can we all see this?
Well, that's the rope dancer.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there we're looking at the rope dancer.
So this is what you're referring to?
That's the rope dancer I'm talking about,
Gotcha.
right?
Cool.
But the thing I'm paralleling it with might even be directly below it. And oh no, that's just a picture of people standing in a room. No, then it would be the large glass. Then if you bring up an image of the large glass by Duchamp.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see.
See what I mean? I'm not sure how we would. The large glass. Yeah, yeah. So if you get one of those, you know, one of the bigger ones. That's only the bride. That's one side of it.
Okay.
It's the
So-
one where it's two panes of glass. It looks like a window. Yeah, there it is. And so below on the left-hand side is the whirling thing, which is the uniforms of the bachelor,
I see.
what they put on. You might find a detail that has just that. But so within, because Duchamp, right. So on the right, as we're looking at it, is the chocolate grinder. And hanging off of one like armature of that chocolate grinder is this thing I'm calling like a whirling thing. And there's a selection of uniforms. I mean, again, we're translating.
Yeah, I can see what you're talking about clearly.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the rope dancer though that's directly the reference, because it's the term and it's Man Ray. And as you said, if Man Ray did it in 1916 and this was 1917, then we're in the same cultural moment. I guess we could call that. It's a cultural moment.
Yeah, I'm glad we brought that up. I just, when we're talking about any kind of visual thing, I like to have the image there. I know I'm a visual thinker, so hopefully that helped us all.
Yeah. Well, the Man Ray is in Manhattan, and Duchamp is in Philadelphia. So let's come to the Northeast. They're really near each other.
Am I wrong? But was Marcel Duchamp also a sociologist?
I don't think so.
Okay, gotcha.
Don't think so.
Gotcha. All right, let's see.
So shall I continue from that point? Oh, do you want to continue from that point, Nick?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's all that is insignificant, paltry, and cowardly.
Yeah.
I think we're just at the top of page 35.
Okay, top of page 35 here. All that is insignificant, paltry, and cowardly in us cowers and shrinks from this acceptance. And there is an excellent pretext for this. We discover that the other in us is indeed another, a real man who actually thinks, does, feels, and desires all the things that are despicable and odious. In this way, we can seize hold of the bogey and declare war on him to our satisfaction. Hence those chronic idiosyncrasies of which the history of morals has preserved some fine examples. A particularly transparent example is already cited, Nietzsche contra Wagner, contra Paul, etc. But daily life abounds in such cases. By this ingenious device, a man may save himself from the Faustian catastrophe, before which his courage and strength might well fell him. A whole man, however, knows that his bitterest foe, or indeed a host of enemies, does not equal that one worst adversary, the, quote, other self, who dwells in his bosom. Nietzsche had Wagner in himself, and that is why he envied him Parsifal. But what was worse, he, Saul, also had Paul in him. Therefore, Nietzsche became one stigmatized by the spirit. Like Saul, he had to experience Christification when the, quote, other whispered the ecce homo in his ear. Which of them broke down before the cross, Wagner or Nietzsche?
Oh.
I mean, geez, Louise. Like almost a freaking book in a paragraph, the amount of Christian history and also just early European history, and that is really crazy.
And the notion of the hero's journey, right? Because that's kind of what Parsifal is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I mean, there are several different stories that surround.
Definitely called into question these days, the whole notion of the hero's journey, right? But we are, and I think Jung, but isn't Jung questioning it in a sort of rudimentary way?
Is that a question? Are you saying?
Yeah, I'm asking. Yeah, isn't Jung questioning that? I mean, in your opinion, Nick, isn't he questioning that?
I would say so. Of course, this is speculation, but I would imagine that Jung would definitely object to the idea of the hero's journey. But I also don't think that it's probably understood as properly as it could be. I think generally the notion is taken to mean that there's this monomyth underlying all myths, and that all myths can be reduced down into this hero's journey myth. But yeah, I mean, Jung writes at several points in his career about this famous dream that he had, now famous. He called it the Siegfried Dream, where he had to kill the hero within himself to kind of come into the fullness of his later life.
Right.
I mean, in that sense, yes. I mean, he was definitely speaking out against this notion of chronic heroism, like he's talking about earlier in this chapter. Which he very much, in the language of the Red Book, identified as kind of a spirit of the times thing rather than a spirit of the depths. But yes, gosh, there's so much here. It's really
and we're of course talking post Joseph Campbell and post that other level, which I think is in a sense based on philology in a way, that other level of identifying past mythologies, bringing them together, Margaret Mead, all this stuff that then Joseph Campbell kind of codified as the hero with 1,000 faces, these concepts that we now take for granted, but that they weren't around in Jung's time. Jung, I think, was examining it in advance of this exploration that has happened, maybe let's call it second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with Jung's theory of archetypes, I think he paves the way for people like Joseph Campbell. And without that, I don't know if Campbell would have been able to arrive at his notion of the hero's journey. And yeah, it's not in vogue anymore, I wouldn't say. But at the same time, I still think there's some merit to understanding what Campbell said about the hero's journey and its function for people who've turned to myth over thousands and thousands of years. I mean, it certainly is kind of perhaps not politically correct, I suppose, but there are certainly many aspects, arguably more so, that are valuable than not.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Yeah, and it's crazy too, like this idea of the Paul's conversion experience that he just packs into the end of this paragraph in 3 or 4 lines. Esau also had Paul in him. You know, I'm not overly familiar with biblical story, so I had to look into this. But you know, Paul was apparently persecuted Christians, and before having his conversion experience. So very much like, Nietzsche was kind of extremely opposed to Wagner. Paul was extremely opposed to Christ until he had this extreme conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And then later, Jung says, therefore, Nietzsche became one stigmatized by the spirit. Like Saul, he had to experience Christification, and the quote, other whispered, the ecce homo, behold the man, in his ear. Which of them broke down before the cross, Wagner or Nietzsche? Frankly, I wish I had something to add to that, but I don't. That's
yeah, I didn't remember that story of Paul persecuting, the nature of his conversion and how extreme that was. So thank you for telling us about that.
Yeah, this is something that I've always kind of, I guess has kind of always irked me a little bit. But I think Jung said once that someone essentially needs to know how to read Latin and Greek fluently and know the Bible front to back to understand my psychology. And I've always just been like, yeah, I don't know, maybe not. But then there are times when I read something like this, I'm like, damn it, it's true.
You know what? My mother used to say that my education was lacking because the schools that were available to me did not teach Latin or Greek or, this kind of high church Episcopalian, what do you even call it? The whole rigmarole, right? So all the stories, because that wasn't there. She always treated me as if, well, you'll never understand anything. Like what you'll pick up a book and what'll you understand? You'll only understand this much. Whereas she herself had this education that was no longer available. Like the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket because people of my generation, and which is going forward, people are not learning Greek and Latin and the classics and the biblical framework for this civilization, let's call it.
Yeah.
I think that's how
I mean, I've brushed up against that myself, just in reading people like Jung or other people from his time. And so many of the words they use, you have to track down the etymology and stuff to really understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
Or to get some specialized sense of how they're using the word, like stigmatized in this case.
Right. Stigmata.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also there are just so many of the classic books that people stopped reading. So I mean, it's almost an overwhelming burden not knowing all of the stories that are in the Bible and everything. I'm 27 years old, and in some sense I feel like I'm a whole lifetime behind for not having read that stuff when I was really, really young. So I can deeply relate. Okay. All right. Who's up next on 44?
Yeah, sure. Fate willed it that one of Freud's earliest disciples, Alfred Adler, should formulate a view of neurosis based exclusively on the power principle. It is of no little interest, indeed singularly fascinating, to see how utterly different the same things look when viewed in a contrary light. To take the main contrast first, with Freud, everything follows from antecedent circumstances according to a rigorous causality. With Adler, everything is a teleological, quote, arrangement, close quote. Here is a simple example. A young woman begins to have attacks of anxiety. At night, she wakes up from a nightmare with a blood-curdling cry, is scarcely able to calm herself, clings to her husband and implores him not to leave her, demanding assurance that he really loves her, etc. Gradually, a nervous asthma develops, the attacks also coming on during the day.
Kind of a funny example. I don't know. Maybe I'm insensitive. I don't know, but it just sounds like something he cooked up, kind of.
Right. Should we go on though? Whoa. And then
yes, certainly. But I just want to point out that this is kind of a turning point in the chapter where he transitions from talking about Nietzsche to where he moves into talking about Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, and how Sigmund Freud had his sexual theory was the nucleus of his entire work. And then Alfred Adler had this idea of the inferiority complex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so, I don't want to spoil too much, but I think that I will anyways. He's laying the groundwork for what he talks about in the next chapter, which is, the next chapter is called The Problem of the Attitude Type. And he's just making this claim that because of the disposition of Freud and the difference in disposition of Adler, they both notice different things in the neuroses of their patients. Mm-hmm. And Adler's theory is a thoroughly introverted theory.
Right.
And Freud's theory is a thoroughly extroverted theory. And he goes into more detail about that, but I just think that that's something interesting to take forward when we talk about Adler and Freud in the coming paragraphs. So yes, please continue.
Beth, do you want to begin, or shall I go on a little further?
Why don't you go on a little further?
Okay. The Freudian method at once begins burrowing into the inner causality of the sickness and its symptoms. What were the first anxiety dreams about? Ferocious bulls, tigers, lions, and evil men were attacking her. What are the patient's associations? A story of something that happened to her before she was married. She was staying at a health resort in the mountains. She played a good deal of tennis and the usual acquaintances were made. There was a young Italian who played particularly well and also knew how to handle a guitar in the evening. An innocent flirtation developed, leading once to a moonlight stroll. On this occasion, the Italian temperament, quote, unexpectedly, close quote, broke loose, much to the alarm of the unsuspecting girl. He gave her, quote, such a look, close quote, that she could never forget it. This look follows her even in her dreams. The wild animals that pursue her look at her just like that. But does this look in fact come only from the Italian? Another reminiscence is instructive. The patient had lost her father through an accident when she was about 14 years old. Her father was a man of the world and traveled a good deal. Not long before his death, he took her with him to Paris, where they visited, among other places, the Folies Bergère. There, something happened that made an indelible impression on her. On leaving the theater, a painted hussy jostled her father in an incredibly brazen way. Looking in alarm to see what he would do, she saw this same look, this animal glare in his eyes. This inexplicable something followed her day and night. From then on, her relations with her father changed. Sometimes she was irritable and subject to venomous moods. Sometimes she loved him extravagantly. Then came sudden fits of weeping for no reason. For a time, whenever her father was at home, she suffered at table from a horrible gulping, accompanied by what looked like choking fits, generally followed by loss of voice for 1 or 2 days. When the news of the sudden death of her father reached her, she was seized by uncontrollable grief, which gave way to fits of hysterical laughter. However, she soon calmed down. Her condition quickly improved and the neurotic symptoms practically vanished. A veil of forgetfulness was drawn over the past. Only the episode with the Italian stirred something in her of which she was afraid. She then abruptly broke off all connection with the young man. A few years later, she married. The first appearance of her present neurosis was after the birth of her second child, just when she made the discovery that her husband had a certain tender interest in another woman. The plot thickens.
Yes, quite. Yes, this was a pretty hilarious chapter. I mean, a paragraph, honestly. I mean, I guess there's some real suffering in there as well. So I guess it's wrong to laugh, but at the same time, a painted hussy jostled her father in an incredibly brazen way. Oh gosh, maybe I'm immature. I don't know.
But it was the look on his face. It wasn't even the brazen gesture from the woman. It was the look of the man.
Yeah, the look of her father.
Yeah. Well, the look of the Italian man and then the look of her father. And so it sounds like she must have had a pretty dispassionate husband who never had that look in his eye, right?
I guess not.
Guess not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if either of you have anything to add to this, but I feel that we could probably just keep going unless you do. I think the next couple of chapters, he's just kind of going to be going through this case.
We probably should go on because, I might start telling tales out of school that I probably shouldn't. So.
All right. Let's see. Beth, is it you or I?
I think it's me.
Okay.
Good.
46. This history gives rise to many questions. For example, what about the mother? Concerning the mother, the relevant facts are that she was very nervous and spent her time trying every kind of sanatorium and method of cure. She too suffered from nervous asthma and anxiety symptoms. The marriage had been of a very distant kind as far back as the patient could remember. Her mother did not understand the father properly. The patient always had the feeling that she understood him much better. She was her father's confessed darling and was correspondingly cool at heart towards her mother.
Mm. You can see the workings of this inferiority complex here taking root.
Yeah, and it looks like that kind of cold or at least cool marriage between her parents set a pretty good example for the patient to marry someone where the feelings were relatively speaking cool and distant, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also important to note that there's this distinction going on between Adler and Freud. And with Freud, it's almost like Freud is always accused of determinism or positivism, of being saying that external factors, objects outside of the subject, determine the subject.
Mhm.
So relations with your parents, essentially you never escape that. Whatever your relationships are like with your parents, you'll then find that in every partner that you want to ever be with, and you'll never really escape that. So with Adler, it's quite different. He's saying that really everything starts with the the subjective experience of the individual.
Mhm.
All right, so 47. These hints may suffice to give us an overall picture of the illness. Behind the present symptoms lie fantasies which are immediately related to the experience with the Italian, but which clearly point back to the father, whose unhappy marriage gave the little daughter an early opportunity to secure for herself the place that should have properly been filled by the mother. Behind this conquest, there lies, of course, the fantasy of being the really suitable wife for the father. The first attack of neurosis broke out at a moment when this fantasy received a severe shock, probably the same shock that the mother had also received, though this would be unknown to the child. The symptoms are easily understandable as an expression of disappointed and slighted love. The choking is due to that feeling of constriction in the throat, a well-known concomitant of violent affects which cannot be quite, quote, swallowed down. Parentheses, the metaphors of common speech, as we know, frequently relate to such physiological phenomena. When the father died, her conscious mind was grieved to death, but her shadow laughed after the manner of Till Eulenspiegel. Don't know who that is, but who was doleful when things went downhill, but full of merry pranks on the weary way up, always on the lookout for what lay ahead. When her father was at home, she was dejected and ill. When he was away, she always felt much better, like the innumerable husbands and wives who hide from each other the sweet secret that neither is altogether indispensable to the other. Gosh. But yeah, again, like he's saying in the case of Nietzsche with the core of the poodle, there's clearly this other side to whatever the conscious mind, whatever the ego seems to hold as its values. The opposites are just lurking in the unconscious and waiting for a moment to kind of rear their ugly head. So where he says, let's see. When the father died, her conscious mind was grieved to death, but her shadow laughed after the manner of Till Eulenspiegel, who was doleful when things went downhill, etc.
Well, this is another case like with Faust and with Parsifal and with Faust, of having these literary cultural figures that Jung is referring to as if we all know what they are. And Till Eulenspiegel is a like an old German folktale story, but it became an opera by Richard Strauss. So again, it's more of this Wagnerian Strauss, grandiose, whatever you want to call it. But the character is, as opposed to Faust, right, who is, the magic bullet, making a deal with the devil, that business. Der Eulenspiegel is a prankster. It's like the trickster.
Ah, okay, cool.
So it's bringing up another, I feel like this is more of Jung kind of just giving tantalizing little tastes of what these archetypes are going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always interesting too. There's always this oppositional thing going on. I've noticed with each of these references that we've talked about. And now thinking back on Parzival, I remember that the name Parzival also shares the same root with something like parsimony, which means the simplest answer you can give for something. Or in the case of Parzival, I'm pretty sure it means the foolish, simple one.
I think he's the fool in the tarot.
Right.
Yeah.
Later he becomes the hero of the story. And
Exactly.
it's almost through happenstance. I mean, he just kind of stumbles his way into the right situation and it's like, oh,
Right.
me. But also the hero.
Right. And what is it literally? Spiegel is a glass or a mirror, or a magnifying glass. What is Eulen? I forget. I feel like it's some kind of bird. See, and now as you may already realize, Nick, like I've studied a lot of languages, but talking about my mother just before makes me remember that one of the reasons I felt driven, and people ask me, why did you study so many languages? Like, I think it was because of the Greek and Latin. An owl. Yeah, it's an owl. It's an owl. So it's like the eagle, not the eagle eye, but the owl's eye spiegel mirror glass, right? So it's, but it's just a name. I mean, it's a classical folktale name, Eulenspiegel, but that's where it comes from.
Yeah. It's also interesting too. The thing that comes to mind is that the owl was often associated with Athena and with wisdom and stuff as well too. So there could be this curious prefiguring kind of a wisdom.
Fool, yeah, Athena's wisdom contrasting with the fool. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see. Who's on 48?
You are, I think. Beth, you were last, yeah? Am I right?
I think I read the last one, but
I think it's Annabelle.
Okay, so I'm starting beginning of 48. That the unconscious had at this juncture some justification for laughing is shown by the supervening period of good health. She succeeded in letting her whole past sink into oblivion. Only the episode with the Italian threatened to resurrect the underworld, but with a quick gesture, she flung the door to and remained healthy until the dragon of neurosis came creeping back just when she imagined herself safely over the mountain in the perfect state, so to speak, of wife and mother. So that's really that safety that we were talking about when I brought up the moral compass, when you talked about Christianity, right? The sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of motherhood, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's certainly she's taken on the role in the script of wife and mother, and at the it seems like everything is hunky dory until there's some clue that might be compromised, and then everything that she thought she had dispelled and would never have to deal with again comes back tenfold. So it seems.
All right.
Let's see. Why don't you go ahead and do 49 too, if you don't mind?
Okay. Sexual psychology says the cause of the neurosis lies in the patient's fundamental inability to free herself from her father. That is why that experience came up again when she discovered in the Italian the mysterious, quote, something, close quote, which had previously made such an overwhelming impression on her in connection with her father. These memories were naturally revived by the analogous experience with her husband, the immediate cause of the neurosis. We could therefore say that the content of and reason for the neurosis was the conflict between the infantile erotic relation to her father and her love for her husband.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to note that Freud's paired with his sexual theory is the idea of object relations, and it's like whatever this thing is that's rearing its ugly head was in relation to an external object. So at the point at which let's see, he says the cause of the neurosis lies in the patient's fundamental inability to free herself from her father. That is why that experience came up again when she discovered in the Italian, the external object, the mysterious something which had previously made such an overwhelming impression on her in connection with her father. So it's interesting that, she was able to just kind of stuff this down within herself, and nothing within herself really jarred this memory up to the conscious mind, but something outside of herself that reminded her of that early formative relation to an external object brought back everything. All right, Beth, are you on 50? Cool.
Yes. If, however, we look at the same clinical picture from the point of view of the quote other, end quote instinct, the will to power, it assumes quite a different aspect. Her parents' unhappy marriage afforded an excellent opportunity for the childish urge to power. The power instinct wants the ego to be, quote, on top, end of quote, under all circumstances, by fair means or foul. The, quote, integrity of the personality, end of quote, must be preserved at all costs. Every attempt, be it only an apparent attempt, of the environment to obtain the slightest ascendancy over the subject is met, to use Adler's expression, by the, quote, masculine protest, end of quote. The disillusionment of the mother and her withdrawal into neurosis created the desired opportunity for a display of power and for gaining the ascendancy. Love and good behavior are, from the standpoint of the power instinct, known to be a choice means to this end. Virtuousness often serves to compel recognition from others. Already as a child, the patient knew how to secure a privileged position with her father through especially ingratiating and affectionate behavior, and to get the better of her mother, not out of love for her father, but because love was a good method of gaining the upper hand. The laughing fit at the time of her father's death is striking proof of this. We are inclined to regard such an explanation as a horrible depreciation of love, not to say a malicious insinuation, until we reflect for a moment and look at the world as it is. Have we not seen countless people who love and believe in their love, and then, when their purpose is accomplished, turn away as though they had never loved? And finally, is not this the way of nature herself? Is, quote, disinterested, end of quote, love at all possible? If so, it belongs to the highest virtues, which in point of fact are exceedingly rare. Perhaps there is in general a tendency to think as little as possible about the purpose of love. Otherwise, we might make discoveries which would show the worth of our love in a less favorable light.
Yeah, so again, here he's making a further distinction between the Adlerian will to power and the inferiority complex and all of his thought, and Freud's sexual psychology, and showing how one doesn't quite account for the situation, nor does the other entirely. Let's see if I can pick up on one line here.
But that phrase, or it's a sentence, is disinterested. Well, the two is disinterested love at all possible. If so, it belongs to the highest virtues. I mean, that makes me think of what's one of the virtues in Buddhism, which is equanimity, impartiality. That is essentially you can take it or leave it, which I think relates to that phrase you used earlier, Nick, of damned if you do and damned if you don't, or however you phrase that, in that sense of like, if everything is on a kind of equal plane, then we're not going to get neurotic, and then we're going to be healthy, and then we're going to see the world for what it is.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure I really believe him in what he's saying right here.
Yeah.
Disinterested love belongs to the highest virtues. I'm not sure. I mean, the way it comes up in Buddhism, it's with love and joy and equanimity and impartiality and compassion. Those are the four. And equanimity and impartiality are only one of those four, where love and joy and compassion are the other three. Here, it's like throwing out the love and throwing out the joy, right? If it's disinterested love, what fun is that? Oh, he's home from work again. Like,
Yeah, I could be wrong, but
it's all the same to me. He left, he's returned, he's with me, he's not with me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then there's also like a kind of taking for granted, like, okay, I'm married, that's it, sign the contract, rest of the life. You die first or I die first, like throw the coin, throw the dice. I don't know, right? Isn't that what disinterested love is?
I would think so. Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think he's being facetious here. I think that he's pointing to the peculiarity of something like that rather than the actual existence of that, and saying, if that kind of thing exists, it belongs among the highest virtues. But it's almost like he's in between the lines. He's saying, but I doubt it.
Right. But if he's being facetious with this, which kind of implies we can take this with a grain of salt, how much of everything else he said up until this point are we going to take with a grain of salt also? I
think that's in some sense the point, because he's trying to point out the inadequacy of the sexual theory and the inadequacy of of Adler's thought. And there's a line where he says earlier, let's see if I can find it here, where he kind of is just encouraging this is in the first paragraph. He said, it can readily be understood that a school of psychology, even if it be biased and exaggerated in this or that respect, which insists on the see me side, is unwelcome, not to say frightening, because it forces us to gaze in the bottomless abyss of this problem.
Right.
And it seems like, with all this stuff about harmonization of culture and nature and these two different schools of psychology and the will to power, the title being the other point of view, the will to power, I think he's saying that neither of these really account for the total human. And they both reflect the thinker's disposition more than the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and that also brings up that part when you talked about it as the hinting of Jung's idea of compensation, where it was the extreme joy or something or other of the hero up here, and then the inevitable plunge.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess this is reflecting back on that too. So maybe he's saying there is no purpose in love, in a way. Right? I mean,
perhaps.
Maybe there doesn't have to be.
Let's see.
I guess he's going to tell us later.
I think he breaks it down a little bit more in the coming paragraphs, which there aren't too many left. But
no, we're almost at the end of this show.
he might leave it open. I can't remember how this chapter comes to a close.
And then we really have to finish the book so that we can find out.
Yeah.
So we can solve the mystery at the end.
All right. Okay, I will go on with 51 here. Okay, the patient then had a laughing fit at the death of her father. She had finally arrived on top. It was an hysterical laughter, a psychogenic symptom, something that sprang from the unconscious motives and not from those of the conscious ego. That is a difference not to be made light of, and one that also tells us whence and how certain human virtues arise. Their opposites went down to hell, or, in modern parlance, into the unconscious, where the counterparts of our conscious virtues have long been accumulating. Hence, for very virtue we wish to, I think this is meant to be hence for every virtue we wish to know nothing of the unconscious. Indeed, is the acme of virtuous sagacity to declare that there is no such thing as the unconscious. But alas, it fares with us all as with Brother Medardus in Hoffman's tale, the devil's elixir. Somewhere we have a sinister and frightful brother, our own flesh and blood counterpart, who holds and maliciously hoards everything that we would so willingly hide under the table. And I'm also just thinking back to earlier chapters where he was kind of talking about ascetic movements within Stoicism and Christianity, and how in the beginning of this, where he's talking about, on the one hand, Nietzsche wanted to oppose everything that Christianity put forth, and then Christianity sought to free man from everything that was animal or based within man. And it seems like something that I always appreciate about Jung is that you really get the full gamut of human potential, and it's not so much an ideal, but rather it's like he's constantly trying to say it's all there, it's all present, and it behooves us to deal with it rather than to think that we're holy and virtuous at all times.
And here he's introduced another kind of classic of German culture, opera, is this. I mean, I would assume, because it's Hoffmann, that it might have been turned into an opera, The Devil's Elixir. So we've had Goethe, Strauss, Wagner, now Hoffmann. He's calling on the greats of the German culture.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe there are also like a familiar language or something, right? Maybe he thinks that a German reader is going to understand better what he's saying when he refers to something common, something commonly understood. Like if we say Elvis, then we have a certain idea.
Yeah,
role, personality, almost like Western civilization. When he says Goethe, Faust, Strauss, and Hoffmann, E.T.A. Hoffmann, he's also.
I would certainly assume that he's saying, these cultural tropes that we can see in different operas or works of art are eternally playing out. And
right.
There are other examples that we can turn to. You don't have to just take it on my authority.
Right. Okay, that's a good way to look at it. But it still is the devil. I mean, it's Hoffmann talking about the devil again, the way Faust was talking about the devil.
All right, Beth, you want to take up 52?
Yes. The first outbreak of neurosis in our patient occurred the moment she realized that there was something in her father which she could not dominate. And then in a great light dawned. She now knew what was the purpose of her mother's neurosis, namely that when you encounter an obstacle which cannot be overcome by rational methods and charm, there is still another method, hitherto unknown to her, which her mother had already discovered beforehand, i.e., neurosis. So from now on, she imitates her mother's neurosis. But what, we may ask in astonishment, is the good of a neurosis? What can it do? Anyone who has in his neighborhood a definite case of neurosis knows well enough what it can, quote, do, unquote. There is no better method of tyrannizing over the entire household. Heart attacks, choking fits, spasms of all kinds produce an enormous effect that can hardly be surpassed. Oceans of sympathy are let loose. There is the anguish of worried parents, the running to and fro of servants, telephone bells, hurrying doctors, difficult diagnoses, elaborate examinations, lengthy treatments, heavy expenses, and there in the midst of all the hubbub lies the innocent sufferer, with everybody overflowing with gratitude when at last she recovers from her, quote, spasms, end of quote.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really kind of poignant example of what I take to be this will to power in the Adlerian sense, though, where he's saying rather than it just being external forces determining the subjectivity of the individual, here that's completely flipped around, and it's like the subjective experience of this one person, this one neurotic person, controls the world outside of themselves, and it all really comes back to the subject, which is a weird kind of passive power, but nonetheless a power. I also just want to point this out. There's this, I don't know if this has quite come into focus at this point in Jung's writing. Maybe it has, but it's certainly echoed in later writings of his where he, let's see here, where he says, but what, we may ask in astonishment, is the good of a neurosis? What can it do? Anyone who has in his neighborhood a definite case of neurosis knows well enough what it can, quote, do. There's no better, and then he kind of transitions into saying, one can tyrannize an entire household by being extremely neurotic. But it's really interesting, there's several lines from Jung later in his life where he says something to the effect of like, neurosis is a substitution for real suffering. And also there's in one of his essays called The Symbolic Life, he says, I'm not altogether pessimistic about neurosis. In many cases, we have to say, thank heaven he decided to be neurotic. Neurosis is really an attempt at self-cure. And he always he echoes this sentiment in several places, not only about neurosis, but also about dreams, where he's saying that, since dreams are spontaneous contents of the unconscious, they seem esoteric and difficult to understand to us, but a dream's meaning already is latent within the dream symbol itself. It knows its own meaning, more or less. And I think it's a similar thing that he's doing with talking about neurosis, where he's saying that the cause of the neurosis and the cure of the neurosis are all contained within the neurosis or the suffering behind it.
So the dreams also might be a guide to self-cure.
Absolutely, yeah. In that quote from The Symbolic Life, he goes on to say something about dreams are the closest parallel to this other product of the self-regulating psyche. All right, I can't remember if it's
yeah, that's me next.
Okay.
The unsurpassable arrangement, to use Adler's expression, was discovered by the little one and applied with success whenever her father was there. It became superfluous when the father died, for now she was finally on top. The Italian was dropped overboard when he laid too much emphasis on her femininity by an appropriate reminder of his virility. But when a suitable chance of marriage presented itself, she loved and resigned herself without a murmur to the fate of wife and mother. So long as her revered superiority was maintained, everything went swimmingly. But once her husband had a little bit of interest outside, she had recourse, as before, to that exceedingly effective, quote, arrangement, close quote, for the indirect exercise of her power, because she had again encountered the obstacle, this time in her husband, which previously in her father's case had escaped her mastery. Now we have mastery, power and mastery.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess she felt when she married her husband that she had mastery over him. And that's part of the sanctity of marriage, was not only her being relegated to her role and having the limits and therefore the, the framing, or what did you call it? Scaffolding, right?
Right,
That
yeah.
could contain her and make her safe. But she also was master of her own domain, which included her husband, she
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Little did she know.
Yes.
Danger that lurked within.
Yeah, and things slipped just beyond her control, and at that point had recourse to the same effective arrangement.
All right.
So yeah, I mean, it's again quite interesting that there was one line that reminded me of something here. Let's see here.
I like the way the Italian was dropped overboard. I mean, we haven't had her floating on her little canoe until right there.
What's up, Skeb? Welcome back.
Thanks. I'm busy expelling an interloper here from the YouTube channel. So we had a troll, but he is gone.
Ah.
Very well then.
I won't even bother telling you what he was saying. It was pretty.
Yeah, I haven't even looked at the YouTube chat throughout this. Yeah.
We've been busy.
That's right.
So I'll do this.
Yeah, I think it's your turn anyway.
Yeah, cool. I'll just go ahead and do these last two so we can wrap up here. This is how things look from the point of view of psychology. I feel the reader must feel like the Katie who, having heard the counsel for the one party, said, "Thou hast well spoken. I perceive that thou art right." Then came the other party, and when he had finished, the Katie scratched himself behind the ear and said, "Thou hast well spoken. I perceive that thou also art right." It is unquestionable that the urge to power plays an extraordinarily important part. It is correct that the neurotic symptoms and complexes are also elaborate, quote, arrangements which inexorably pursue their aims with incredible obstinacy and cunning. Neurosis is teleologically oriented, which is, again, kind of what I was saying about neurosis as a substitution for real suffering, and also that neurosis contains the cure within itself. By saying neurosis is teleologically oriented, he's saying that it aims at the perfection of the person, or the fullness of the person, even though it seems like quite the opposite. In establishing this, Adler has won for himself no small credit. Which of the 2 points of view is right? That is a question that might lead to much brain racking. One simply cannot lay the two explanations side by side, for they contradict each other absolutely. In the one, the chief and decisive fact is Eros and its destiny. In the other, it is the power of the ego. In the first case, the ego is merely a sort of a sort of appendage to Eros. In the second, love is just a means to the end, which is ascendancy. Those who have the power of the ego most at heart will revolt against the first conception, but those who care most for love will never be reconciled to the second. And that's the end of the chapter. I also, this might not be a reference that anybody is familiar with right offhand, but this reference to the Katie, I don't know what that actually is, but it's so funny. It makes me think of this scene from the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which is based on
Right.
the Odyssey. But there's a scene where it's really early in the movie. They've just broken free from prison, and the kind of, for lack of a better word, the simpleton of the group, both the guys are kind of having some back and forth about who's going to be the leader of their little party. And one's like, well, I'm voting for yours truly. And the other one's like, well, so am I. And then they turn to the other guy, I think his name is Delmar, and he's like, well, I'm with you fellers. And he isn't the deciding vote at all. And it's pretty much like, well, both of you guys are right. I'm with you both. And it just reminded me of that. So I'll just bring that up. But yeah, that brings it to a close.
Okay, thank you, sir. Wonderful.
Nora, did you read the last paragraph?
I
Which
did.
of the 2 points of you is right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, you did. Okay.
Yeah, but to go back on your question about
Yeah.
disinterested love and all of that stuff, I think that he leaves it open and says that neither of these point of views is really right, because they contradict each other absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to hold the opposite. It's duality.
Yeah.
All things are in duality. And
I think that's absolutely the case, but I think here it's almost as if he's saying that both of those thinkers assert their theory as being true and beyond equivocation. I mean, Freud said the sexual theory is everything. Everything can be accounted for by this. And I know less about Adler, but I assume since he's putting those two together, that he also said, no, it all lies with this theory.
Right.
So yeah, I would say they both have a seat at the table, but I think he's really just trying to shed light on the fact that both of these thinkers were saying, I have it right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you read the chapter, Skip?
I read the first half of it, and I thought it was interesting that he was talking about the shadow, really, for the first time, or not the first time, but he was doing another explication of that, and I honestly have to leave it to that because I fell asleep, and I'm not really compos mentis right now.
Yeah.
I apologize. But anyway, I'll be back, or we'll be back next Monday and carry on. And that's the this is the next chapter, is the one about personality types, which Nick likes so much. And
yeah, it's really great because he takes Freud and Adler and attempts to describe why they found what they found in their theories. It's a pretty long chapter, so I doubt we'll get through even the bulk of it. But even still, in the first sections, it becomes clear what he's building up.
Well, I do concur with you that it's an extremely important chapter, and just to, the entire Department of Defense thinks so too, because they I had the privilege of attending 5 senior schools in the U.S. military, and I went to the reserve course, so it was a 2-week course. But in all of those places, they spent 1 day out of the 10 days that they had you. They had you there for 10 business days in these senior schools as a reservist. And one of the days, so 10% of the time, was spent on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is what this is about. And I found that hugely beneficial to me. I had it drilled into my head from 1987 to 89, which were, 2 of my years. I kept going to senior schools. Then I broke my leg and didn't do any more marining. But I had it in me. And so that was in 91, January 4th, 1990. I'm sorry, 1990, January 4th. And ever since then, I've used the Myers-Briggs, in my head.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because the way that he's talking about Freud and Adler, he's using this subject-object thing. And like I've said, Freud is all about object relations, and Adler, as an introvert, was all about something that's generated out of subjectivity.
Mm-hmm,
there is no talk of object, really.
Yeah.
And he really gets into that in the next chapter, and it's extremely helpful because it's almost like you see all of Freud's theory in the light of typology. And it's really,
and it really helped me in my business career, because ever since then, from 1990 on, I built a business career and took a company public that involved very, very different people. I mean, 40 different production centers in India, several in Pakistan, 5 in Bangladesh, for example, very, very different points of view, and then in Saudi Arabia and Oman. And I really got the up close and personal experience of seeing how these people were behaving. Mm-hmm. And because I had the role of the leader of the group, I was trained how to be a leader. And it was just remarkable and extremely helpful. And I urge everyone to pay attention to that, pay attention to next week, pay attention to psychological types, which is the entirety of volume 6. And
I also just want to add, since we've been talking about Nietzsche this past week, there's a chapter in Psychological Types where he talks about, I think like the whole first, 400 or 500 pages of that book is just Jung going through like thousands of years of the history of philosophy and foundational thinkers and looking at their thought from the perspective of typology. But I think he spends there's a pretty significant chunk of that book that deals with Nietzsche and the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, which we talked about a lot tonight. Well, particularly the Dionysian.
So as I say, these things are hugely important. And for everybody, the YouTube audience, and we've had a good audience here this evening, it seems, but for the YouTube audience and for the Zoom group, there are pieces of incredible wisdom here that if you understand them, you're going to be very successful in life. And if you don't, maybe you won't. Anyway, so Patrick Hollywood says, I am misunderstood. Thankfully, with the help of those around here, have helped me a lot. Looking forward to what's to come. And Patrick says, I've done the test over 4 years and still comes out the same. Well, it won't change. I've done the test for more than 30 years now, and it came out extremely lopsided the first time, and it never changed. and so I took the course once from the Center for Creative Leadership, something you probably have never heard of, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's just an incredible group. Beth, you seem to know it.
I live there. I don't know it though, but I've driven by.
You live in Greensboro, Beth? Oh, cool. I live in Boone, North Carolina, so not far away from you.
Yeah, if you ever get a chance to do even a 1 week or a 4-day program at the Center for Creative Leadership, do it. It will change your life. It is such a special place. And it certainly changed my life. And it's interesting to note that the U.S. Army requires every selected brigadier general to go there for their main course. I forget actually what they call it, but anyway, for the main course that they teach there, they require every newly selected brigadier general, before they can wear stars, they have to go to that school. And it's just amazing. They have a simulation there that is 2 days long, and it simulates being in a business. And everybody that's there for that particular event, let's say there are 40 of us, and we get divided into 10 groups, or 4 groups of 10, and then we are competitive with one another in the simulation. It's called the looking glass, and basically it says, "This is you. Do you like it?" and you got to admit there's some shadow there, so it's really worth knowing and knowing about. And I really appreciate having had those opportunities. And if I had done nothing else in the U.S. Marine Corps but go to those 5 schools, it would have been worth that to be able to do that. I did it at the Naval War College, the National War College, the Industrial War College, or the Industrial College, the Armed Forces, and Command and Staff College in the Marine Corps. And it just, well, we had this experience back on January 6th, where we happened to have been in a class at the time when it was going on. And there was very, very serious concern in the group that maybe the Army would turn against the United States and come in and put us into martial law or something like that. And I said, no, they won't. That's not going to happen. There's no chance of it. And, you know, it's basically because I had the opportunity to attend those schools. You know, I did have a 23-year career, but of actively involvement in the Marine Corps, but those 5 schools were just very special. The 5th one being the Center for Creative Leadership. So,
hey, Skip, could I?
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question, and we might need to maybe I can just broach the topic, and maybe we can just bench it for next week, because I'll just say it's probably a huge question. But I'm curious. You know, I've been reading the Red Book recently. I'm curious, what do you think about Jung of the Red Book, and then Jung of this book that we're reading right now?
well, Jung of the Red Book was purely instinct, kind of. He was speaking from the unconscious. He was just taking down notes on what he was being fed by the unconscious. And he did it for 5 years. He did that process that became the Black Books and then the Red Books for 5 years. And it was just a raw experience where you're really taken over by archetypal energies. And I know that because it happened to me. Okay. But I didn't know that for 16 years because it happened to me in 1993, but the Red Book came out in 2009.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, my experience came out as a novel, and the novel is pornographic in parts, and it's extremely explicit. And here I was this, successful business executive. I'd been to Japan. I started a company in Japan. And then I brought my family back from Japan, separated from my wife, and never looked back, and blah, blah, blah. But it was a traumatic time for me. And in that experience, I had no context. I had, I'd heard of Jung, and I heard of Jung because I had taught at the University of Maryland Graduate School. And one of my fellow teachers, professors, was a PhD in psychologist, beautiful animal figure, beautiful. And she came in and was hot to trot to teach me the MBTI. This was before I started to take it from the military. And so I said, wow, yeah, if this beautiful woman wants to teach me about Jung and the MBTI, I guess I better listen. And so I did that. And then in 1990, I Man and His Symbols, the book that Jung wrote for laymen, just popped off the shelf in a bookstore in Georgetown. And so I read that, and I read it over a year's period with my wife. I read it to her for 1 year, 3 or 4 pages a night. And at the end of that 1 year period, we both felt that we had had a year's psychotherapy. And so then I was, by that time, I was quite interested in Jung. And then along came a Jungian analyst named Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and she wrote a Jungian book about fairy tales mostly, called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And my mother gave that book to my wife for Christmas, and on Boxing Day, I started to read it, and I didn't put it down for 2 days. I wouldn't let my wife have it. You can't have it. And so what happened in that was that one of the stories in her book lit off for me an archetypal experience. It was very similar to the Red Book, where I was having visitations by physical figures, okay? And I ended up writing a novel called Mako Memoirs of a Woman. So here's this retired Marine lieutenant colonel writing the memoirs of a woman. How do I get away with that? Well, what Estes had done in one of those stories, which is called Vasilisa the Wise, is she had, at the end of it, put the nine steps that a woman goes through in reaching individuation, basically. And it's a 40-page essay in that book. You can read it in the bookstore if you don't want to buy the book. And it really cuts through the 9 things that women need to accomplish psychologically. And at about the same time, Norman Schwarzkopf came back from Gulf War I, and he had his war parade in Washington. And I was really turned off from that because as a retired officer, I'm against the aggrandizement of the military. I don't think that's right at all. And so I refused to watch it. I didn't want to watch it. So I went for a walk around Capitol Hill, and I'm trying to decide what I want to do when I grow up, since I was out of the Marine Corps at that point. And I decided I wanted to write a novel. And so then the question is, what do you write about? And I had read an article by Michael Crichton in the Wall Street Journal that said the key to writing a novel is to ask a question. And so, of course, he asked the question, what happens if you bring dinosaurs back to life, right? And so that was the question he had asked. But my question that came to my mind during that walk was a question that had been in my mind for 33 years, because I had been in Japan as a high school student. And we had a live-in maid who was maybe 7 or 8 years older than me, but young enough to be an anima figure kind of thing. And I remember asking my father one Saturday, what is Michiko doing here? And he was very vague, but I was 15 years old when I asked that question. And he said, well, in Japan, women come to Tokyo to earn their dowry, quote unquote. And so I said, okay, so the question I'm going to ask is, what happens to a woman who comes to Tokyo to earn her dowry and goes through her life and becomes the first woman prime minister of Japan? What would that life look like? And so I wrote that novel, and those Mako, the heroine, who I take from age 15 to age 75, lived that life in my psyche, and those figures actually appeared to me. And so when I got to the end of it, and I realized that there were these pornographic sections, which I knew to be true because I had spent 5 years in Japan as a business executive, I didn't know what to do with it. So I put it in my drawer for 16 years, actually for 20 years. And, but, it sort of disconcerted me because I didn't know whether it was something that the world needed or not. And I didn't know how to explain it. And so I went through, so I said, well, wow, now I have Clarissa Estes' essay on what it takes for a woman to have individuation. So I'm going to apply that 9 steps to my heroine and see what happens. And that's what I did. And so after 2 days, Mako herself began to visit me every morning and wake me up at 6 a.m. And she would not let me stop until I'd written 500 to 1,000 pages on that morning, and sort of one episode in the chronicling of her life. And it was an anima possession. It was an archetypal possession by the anima, and she wasn't going to let me stop until it finishes, because if you're ever possessed by an archetype, you'll know that an archetype, once it starts playing like a record in a jukebox, it will not stop until it goes through all the steps of its life. And so women are familiar with it because of the mother archetype. If you once you ever become a mother, you're always a mother. You're never going to end that for the rest of your life, and there's no hope to change that. And so that's what all archetypes do. They play through until they're done. In the case of a mother, it's until the mother dies. But the anima possession is one that played through me, and and so when the Red Book came out, I recognized it. I recognized what had happened to him. And I said, wow, if that happened to the smartest psychiatrist of the 20th century, maybe it's okay if it happened to me too. And so then I started to think about taking it out of the closet. I finally published it in Kindle form on Amazon in 2014 under my pen name, which is David Garrettson. But it's called Mako Memoirs of a Woman. And I only did it when I thought I could explain psychologically what was happening to me. But I recognized it as what was happening to Jung. And so when he says that this was really the prima materia for everything else I did, I could see that as I started to get into Jung and read all the things that he read or he wrote and so on. It just really clicked. It continues to click for me all the time.
Yeah, the reason that I asked you is because it seems like at least the first couple of essays in this volume are probably at least sketched out in the period before the Red Book happened. Like before the Black Books were recorded.
Yeah, I think that's true. This is a very young Jung. He hasn't gotten his mind around everything that's coming through him.
Yeah. I really quickly, I want to share a couple of things with the group, and then I want to read a thing from the Red Book. It's super quick, but it
go for it.
The reason for me asking this.
Beth,
since you live in Greensboro, I want to specifically recommend this to you. There's a store in Winston-Salem called Edwin McKay's. Maybe you all have heard of it. I went there recently last week and looked through their philosophy and psychology section. I got some absolutely outstanding books. I got, I think, 20 books for $40, 45 bucks, something like that. But let me just show you all of the Jungian books that I got there, and then I'll tell you how much I got them all for. Okay, so I got Art in the Creative Unconscious by Neumann. I got Thomas More's commentary on the Book of Job. I got The Goddess in Every Man by Jean Shinoda Bolen, who is a contemporary of Estes. And they also had like 10 versions of Clarissa Pinkola Estes, The Women Who Run with Wolves. I got Robert Johnson's We, Psychology and the Occult by Jung, which I guess is it's part of the Princeton Bollingen series. I got The Golden Ass of Apuleius, von Franz, Interpretation of Fairy Tales by von Franz, Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales by von Franz, Thomas More's Care of the Soul, Iron John by Robert Bly, and I got this book called Cross Currents of Jungian Thought, and it was put together by a man named Donald R. Dyer, which I had never heard of, but I found out that he's actually a North Carolina native, and he started I think it's like a North Carolina Jung Society. It's called the Jung Society of the Triangle, and it's in the Triangle of Durham, Raleigh. I guess is Greensboro the other point of the triangle? No,
it's
Durham, Raleigh, Chapel Hill.
Chapel Hill, yeah.
There we go. Yeah. So that was cool to find out. I got all those books for under $5. They were all like 75 cents a piece.
And what's the name of the store?
Edwin McKay's. It's like a used bookstore.
Oh,
I mean, they have thousands and thousands and thousands of
I'm
books.
gonna have to visit North Carolina.
Honestly, I think it's a chain, and I bet they have one close to you.
Yeah, we have one here, I think, in Greensboro.
Yeah,
Unless I was thinking, I know things have started to close down, but
yeah. Well, this one is wide open. I could have spent half the day in there, but I was with my partner Savannah, and she was elbowing me to get the heck out of there. So I could have spent $100. But
how do you spell McKay?
McKays.
Okay.
Yeah, and the section from the Red Book that I just want to read quickly, and then I personally need to check out after this.
Yep.
But anyways, but the spirit of this time stepped up to me and laid before me huge volumes which contained all my knowledge. Their pages were made of ore, and a steel stylus had engraved inexorable words in them, and had pointed to these inexorable words and spoke to me and said, quote, "What you speak, that is madness. It is true. It is true. What I speak is the greatness and intoxication and ugliness of madness." But the spirit stepped up to me, and the spirit of the depths stepped up to me and said, "What you speak is, the greatness is, the intoxication is, the undignified, sick, paltry dailiness is. It runs in all the streets, lives in all the houses, and rules the day of all humanity." And I mean, it's so interesting to think about what he's taught. And there's a footnote reference to, I don't think it's right here, but there's another at a section which comes shortly after that.
That was from the Supreme Meaning, was it? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's just, he's talking about his word association test in one of the footnotes, and his thoughts on psychopathology, which means, the beliefs of a sick soul and stuff like that. And it's so interesting that so much of what we've been reading tonight was about psychopathology, and it's kind of Jung before he had this experience, and it's very much Jung in the spirit of his time rather than speaking from this deeper and greater perspective. So I just wanted to add that because it seemed like it's interesting to read this and also kind of hold the fact that there's this other Jung going on as well.
yeah,
But with that, I need to check
I have
out.
to go as well. But thank you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Y'all.
Fascinating conversation at the end. I'm sorry I missed the whole thing. Hopefully I'll feel better.
It, Skip, right? It's recorded. You can watch it.
Yeah, I will do. No, I
I don't know
will.
if we'll tell you anything new, Skip, but of course we're all hoping you well, and I'm sure next week we'll be ready to tear into some of the other material.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Yeah. And thank you for being understanding today, everyone. And on Wednesday, Tim Holmes is going to hold forth in the advanced reading group for the same reason, and I'm hoping to be recovered sufficiently after that. So anyway.
All right, everybody, I'm going to check out. I hope to see you all next week.
Yeah,
and
thanks, Nick, for doing this.